During World War One, the main mode of fighting was through trenches. Today we'll be having a closer look at trench warfare by studying the internal structure of the trenches as well as the daily lives of soldiers who had to live there. By the end of this lesson and the flipped content, we should be able to identify and analyze the reasons for different perspectives as a result of trench warfare, whether they're a German or British soldier or a general in the higher offices of the army. And we should also be able to outline the nature of warfare from the trenches and the daily lives of soldiers. So before we begin looking at the conditions of soldiers within trenches, we must first understand the structure of trenches. What you see in front of you is a frontline trench, which is the closest to the battlefield. This is also the trench that is most commonly in the firing line and is the most dangerous one to be in. Some of the features of these trenches are sandbags, which are used to protect soldiers from enemy rifle fire. This is actually lining the parados, which is the back wall of a trench, usually lined with extra protection such as timber. Another layer of protection is a dugout, which can also be used for eating and sleeping. And then we also have duckboards and a sump, which is usually an upraised platform that keeps soldiers' feet from becoming waterlogged, which is a feature that we'll look at in a moment. Most obviously, we have a fire step, which a soldier would step up on to get ammunition and then fire off an elbow rest into enemy territory. And the parapet, of course, at the front is the front protection of the trench. This protected the heads of the men who were firing their rifles off of the elbow rest. We have our last line of defense as well in the barbed wire, which enemy soldiers would have to crawl through in order to get into their enemy trenches. And then finally we have no man's land, which is the area between both territories, both trenches that was constantly being fought over for control by enemies and allies. So some background on trench warfare. Fighting was not continuous along the front line. In fact, timing and location gave soldiers vastly different experiences of war. Going over the top was in fact a rare experience, and it's wrong to think soldiers rarely left the front line or that it was all action all the time. Life in the line was generally a time of unrelieved boredom, punctuated by occasional heart-stopping moments of action. The way that soldiers remembered the trenches contrasts with the way that we imagine battles. One of the most lasting memories was, in fact, the smell for most soldiers. It was a constant, distinctive odor produced by a combination of decaying flesh of humans and horses, latrines, rotting sandbags, stagnant mud, explosion fumes, and body odor. Poor hygiene conditions within the trenches caused many problems with vermin, particularly lice. Trenches were overrun with lice as they made their homes in the seams of clothing, and their eggs were hatched by body heat. On the front line, soldiers might not change their clothes for up to a week, and it was pretty much impossible to live lice-free. Sometimes it also caused disease, such as trench fever. On the right, you'll see an example on the top of lice, and on the bottom, you can see soldiers who are trying to take lice out of their clothes, which is called delousing. Another type of vermin that was common in the front line are rats. They thrived on the plentiful supplies of decomposing flesh available on the battlefields and numbered in the millions. As rats became more used to the environment and a common stream of soldiers and dead bodies, they became more selective with the types of body parts that they ate. As you can see in the pictures on the right, it became extremely common for men in the trenches to hunt mice and even eat them. Then there was the problem of latrines, which were usually buckets or holes in the ground. They were normally dug in special locations within the trenches or behind the front line. Some officers didn't like to wait in line, so they had latrines dug between the front line and the barbed wire. This exposed position was meant to encourage a speedy return to duties and put their life at significant risk. Then there was the issue of the environment. Most British trenches were built with the expectation that it would be a temporary encampment for their soldiers. This meant that a lot of British trenches were ill-prepared and ill-equipped to deal with poor conditions such as wet weather, cold weather, and unsanitary conditions. Some places didn't even have duckboards to prevent soldiers wetting their feet. This led to health issues such as trench foot, which was a prevalent problem in the front lines of trenches. Trench foot is a result of constantly wet and dirty feet that can't be dried or cleaned. It eventually leads to gangrene or amputation, and if a soldier is lucky, they may just be able to last through the illness and keep their foot. But in most cases, they would definitely have to get it amputated. The problem with food wasn't hygiene, much like many of the other problems that soldiers had to face in World War I. Most food was able to be well stored because it was canned or salted and would have a long expiry date. The real problem with food was that there was always enough, but it was always unvaried, and it was always the same. Typical frontline rations were tinned beef, biscuits, and tins of jam, and for more exotic foods and luxury items, you might get a boiled egg or maybe some rum. To your right, there are some examples of food. On the top, it's corned beef, canned corned beef from World War I. On the bottom are some biscuits that have been preserved for a very, very long time and are still around to this day. And in the middle, there's a picture of soldiers sitting down and drinking the rum at Stand Down at Dawn. Because there is so much written evidence today of soldiers who fought in World War I, we never really care to think that the world back then was quite censored. In fact, soldiers were forbidden to keep diaries in the trenches, and they could only bypass this rule by writing on scraps of paper and keeping notes illicitly. Often we only consider history from the side of the victors. Because Australia was part of the Allied side in World War I, and thus the victorious side, we really only consider our own story and our own conditions during the war. However, the Germans had a considerably different experience in trench warfare than the British did. Due to their mostly defensive strategy from a very early point in the war, they were able to build on high terrain, which gave them an advantage, and they were also able to better plan and better structure their trenches. This is contrasted with the Allied belief that the trenches were only a temporary structure that would be used to house and encamp their soldiers. Before your lesson tomorrow, I want you to consider the picture on the left-hand side. Reflect on the following question. What features of the German trenches were so different to the British trenches? Thank you.